to talk to you about different measurements we use to determine if our church is really being fruitful and effective. And so we have different ideas about how you really figure that out. Some people say you can tell if your church is doing well by how many people get to prayer meeting. I think that's a good measurement. Important. Some people say you can tell if your church is doing well by figuring out the attendance at the main weekend services. Others say one of the biggest measurements, and I agree with this one about how healthy your church is figure out how long it takes for the average person to leave your church after you say the benediction. And if it takes 2 or 3 minutes for the average person to be gone, you're probably not very healthy. But if there's a lingering that lasts 10, 12, 15, 20 minutes, there's something going on in your church that is relational and healthy. All good measurements. I want to suggest to you, though, that one of the measurements we sometimes don't pay enough attention to is the measurement of generosity. Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 24. There is one who scatters and yet increases all the more. And there's one who withholds what is justly due, and it only results in want. So one of the things that releases blessing on individuals and on churches is this spirit of generosity. There's one who scatters and yet increases all the more. My first board meeting at the church I presently pastor, 16 and a half years ago, I didn't know enough to even put the agenda together. I wasn't familiar enough with the church to know what needed to be on the agenda, so we kind of just made the agenda when we first sat down at the meeting. What do we need to talk about? And one of the things that was on the agenda was a letter from an Aboriginal church that was going through a difficult time and needed some financial assistance. And that night, the board of the church I pastor said, hey, we've got a new pastor. Why don't we just get off to a brand new start here and say, God, we are trusting you absolutely for our future. And they figured out what they had in the bank. And what they had in the bank is the amount they wrote this check for to this Aboriginal church. And I left that meeting doing two things. First of all, saying, man, I've never seen anything like that before in my life. And secondly, knowing that everything was going to be fine in my ministry there because there was a spirit of generosity. There is that withholds and nothing seems to work out very well, and there is one who scatters and it increases all the more. What's the spirit of generosity like in your church? And do you even know, do you even measure it? And the secret to measuring it is to figure out what your average attendance is for the year. Do you have an average attendance of 43 or 71 or 114, whatever the average number is, and then figure out your total offerings and then divide it by that number, 37, whatever the number is, and then divide it by 52 and find out what your average giving is. And the average giving in most North American churches per week per person is between $37 and $45. If you're lower than that, the economy you're in, the condition of the crops come fall may dictate it a little bit, but if you're lower than that, you're way below average giving in a Canadian church. Figure out if you're generous. And what I do with that number that comes back, $37, $33, $42, whatever it is, I multiply it by 52 to get the giving per year, and then I multiply it by 4 kind of as an average family size. And if that number's not around 7,000 at least, your people probably aren't living very generously, because it's really hard in Saskatchewan to live on a family income of less than 70,000. So are your people being generous? Create a culture of generosity in your church. So here's my questions. Do you know what the number is? Number two, can you compare it to last year and the year before? Are people getting more generous or are they getting less generous? And then talk about it with your board and ask the third question, what do we need to be doing as a church to continue to develop a culture of generosity amongst us? Generosity brings blessing. All the best today and this week as you serve our wonderful Lord. Thanks for listening in.